You're sitting in a basement room at Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, January 1942. It's 0300 hours and you haven't slept in 36 hours. The air smells like stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and the ozone tang of overheated IBM tabulating machines. Around you, 23 other cryptanalysts are hunched over desks covered in paper, intercepted Japanese radio messages, each one a string of 5-digit number groups that mean nothing until you crack them. On the wall in front of you hangs a chart tracking Japanese naval movements across the Pacific. Every dot, every line, every notation came from breaking codes that the Japanese Navy believes are unbreakable. They're wrong. You've been reading their mail for months. But last week, something changed. New messages started appearing that don't match any code system you've ever seen. The number patterns are wrong. The mathematical relationships don't work. And most disturbing of all, the Japanese themselves seem confused by them. You're looking at messages from Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo questioning subordinate commands about transmissions they claim they never sent. You're seeing destroyer captains reporting compass headings that don't match their actual positions. You're watching an entire naval communication network slowly dissolve into chaos because someone, somewhere in the Pacific, is broadcasting fake Japanese messages that are good enough to fool Japanese operators but strange enough to make nothing make sense. You're Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station Hypo, and you're staring at either the most brilliant deception operation in naval history or the work of one crazy American radio operator who's accidentally invented psychological warfare through code confusion. The numbers told a story that nobody at Naval Intelligence wanted to believe. Between January and June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy intercepted 1,247 radio transmissions that appeared to be authentic IJN messages but contained subtle errors, mathematical impossibilities, and operational directives that contradicted real orders from Tokyo. Japanese naval headquarters spent thousands of man-hours trying to determine which messages were legitimate and which were false. Radio operators were interrogated. Code books were audited, security protocols were reviewed. The Japanese never found the source, because the source wasn't a sophisticated intelligence operation run from Washington. It was one 24-year-old radio man second class from Nebraska who'd figured out something nobody else had. You didn't need to break Japanese codes to create chaos. You just needed to make them think their own codes were broken. His name was Richard Dick Holt, and by March 1942, he'd become the Japanese Navy's worst nightmare. Not because he could read their messages, but because he could write new ones they couldn't tell weren't real. Holt was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1918, the son of a telegraph operator for Union Pacific Railroad. He'd grown up around Morse code, listening to his father tap out messages at a railroad depot where every mistake could cause train collisions and deaths. That environment taught lessons that most radio operators never learned. Precision matters, patterns reveal everything, and the difference between legitimate signals and errors was often invisible until disaster struck. Holt enlisted in the U.S. Navy in January 1940, trained as a radio man, and by December 1941 was assigned to the destroyer USS Blue, DD-387, operating out of Pearl Harbor. The Blue had been at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack, returning to find the harbor burning and the Pacific Fleet shattered. In the chaotic weeks that followed, Holt's duties shifted from routine communications to something more urgent: intercepting Japanese naval radio traffic. The Navy didn't tell enlisted radio men what they were intercepting or why. Holt's job was simple: tune through assigned frequencies, copy down any transmissions that matched Japanese signal characteristics, and forward the raw intercepts to Station Hypo for analysis. He didn't need to understand the codes. He just needed to copy them accurately. But Holt was curious in ways that got radio operators in trouble. Instead of just copying messages and forgetting them, he started keeping a personal log. He'd write down the time, frequency, signal strength, and message characteristics of every Japanese transmission he intercepted. After 3 months, he had notebooks filled with data that revealed patterns Station Hypo's cryptanalysts would have found useful if they'd known he was collecting it. The Japanese Navy used a code system designated JN-25 by American intelligence. It was a super-enciphered code, meaning messages were encoded twice for security. First, Japanese plaintext was converted to 5-digit number groups using a code book. 97850 might mean submarine, 18456 might mean attack, and so on. Then those code groups were enciphered again by adding random 5-digit numbers from an additive book, creating the final encrypted message. Breaking JN-25 required stripping away the additive numbers to get back to the code groups, then deciphering those groups to recover the original Japanese text. It was mathematically brutal work that required thousands of intercepted messages to identify patterns. By January 1942, Station Hypo could read about 10–15% of JN-25 traffic, enough to know something important was happening, not enough to know what. But Holt noticed something that the cryptanalysts, buried in their basement analyzing numbers on paper, couldn't see. The Japanese radio operators weren't perfect. They made mistakes. They'd send a message, realize they'd garbled part of it, and retransmit with corrections. Sometimes they'd accidentally send part of a message in the clear, unencoded Japanese text before realizing their error and switching back to code. More importantly, Holt noticed that Japanese call signs, the identifying codes that indicated which ship or station was transmitting, followed predictable patterns. Destroyers used certain call sign structures, cruisers used others. And when stations responded to each other, there were rhythms and timing patterns that revealed which ships were communicating even if you couldn't read the messages. In February 1942, Holt started experimenting. During his off-duty hours, using the Blue's backup radio transmitter, he began broadcasting fake Japanese signals on frequencies he knew Japanese operators monitored. He wasn't trying to send real messages. He was testing to see if he could mimic Japanese radio procedures well enough that Japanese operators would think they were hearing legitimate IJN transmissions. His first attempts were crude. He'd copy the call sign structure from a Japanese destroyer he'd been intercepting, then transmit a short burst of random 5-digit groups. The Japanese ignored it. They probably assumed it was radio interference or an operator error. But then Holt tried something different. Instead of random numbers, he used authentic 5-digit code groups he'd copied from previous Japanese messages, but he rearranged them in ways that created mathematical impossibilities. The additives didn't work. The check digits were wrong. Any Japanese operator who received the message and tried to decode it would get gibberish. On February 19, 1942, Holt transmitted his first successful fake message. He copied a call sign that Japanese destroyer Udachi had been using, waited until the destroyer was at sea away from fleet communications, and transmitted a short message using Udachi's call sign with corrupted code groups. 6 hours later, Holt intercepted a transmission from Japanese Destroyer Division headquarters to Udachi. Retransmit your 1340 message. Receipt garbled. Use check procedures. The Japanese thought Udachi had sent a legitimate message that had been corrupted in transmission. They were trying to get Udachi to resend it. But Udachi had never sent the original message. Holt had. Over the next week, Udachi and division headquarters exchanged increasingly frustrated messages trying to resolve what they thought was a communications failure. Neither side realized they were arguing about a transmission that hadn't come from either of them. Holt had discovered something powerful. You couldn't just broadcast random fake messages and expect chaos. But if you carefully mimicked legitimate Japanese procedures while introducing subtle errors that looked like transmission problems or operator mistakes rather than enemy deception, you could make Japanese operators doubt their own systems. The real breakthrough came when Holt realized he could do more than just create confusion. He could weaponize it. On March 3, 1942, Station Hypo decoded fragments of a Japanese message indicating that a submarine task group was operating near Midway Island. The decode was partial, maybe 40% readable. Enough to know submarines were involved, not enough to know their exact positions or objectives. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort wanted more information. Standard procedure was to wait for more intercepts and hope to build up enough material to break more of the code. but that could take weeks. Holt had a different idea. What if he could make the Japanese talk more? What if he could trigger additional communications that would give Station Hypo more material to work with? He approached his commanding officer aboard Blue, Lieutenant Commander John Davis. Davis was 32 from Boston, a Mustang officer who'd risen from enlisted ranks. He understood radio procedures better than most officers and had learned to trust Holt's instincts about Japanese communications. "Sir, I think I can make the Japanese submarines transmit more messages. Messages that Hypo can intercept and use to break more of the code." Davis looked up from paperwork. "How?" "By making them confused about their own orders. If I broadcast a fake message that looks like it's from their task group commander, but with contradictory instructions, they'll have to break radio silence to ask for clarification. Holt, if you're wrong and they realize we're transmitting fake messages, they'll change their entire code system. We'll lose months of cryptanalysis work. If I'm right, sir, we'll get them to hand us the material we need to read their real messages. Hypo needs more intercepts. I can make the Japanese provide them." Davis made a decision that would later be described in classified reports as either brilliantly unconventional or recklessly dangerous. One transmission. If it works, we continue. If the Japanese change their codes because of it, I'm putting you on report and you'll spend the rest of the war swabbing decks. On March 5, 1942, at 2300 hours, Radio Man Second Class Richard Holt transmitted a carefully crafted fake message using call signs and procedures that matched Japanese submarine communications. The message was 87 five-digit groups, longer than his previous experiments, but still short enough to seem like a routine operational directive. The content, if decoded, would have read something like, "Submarine Unit 3 proceed bearing 185 degrees from Point Baker. Maintain radio silence until 0600 7th day." Except Holt had deliberately corrupted the numerical bearings so they didn't align with real Japanese navigation terminology, and the date reference was ambiguous enough that it could be interpreted multiple ways. The Japanese received the message. 3 submarines that were actually operating as part of Submarine Unit 3 tried to decode it. They got confused. The bearing didn't make sense geographically. The date was unclear. At 0340 hours on March 6th, one of the submarines broke radio silence to request clarification from its actual commander. That transmission was intercepted by Station Hypo. At 0520 hours, the submarine task group commander responded with a real, legitimate message. Unit 3, disregard previous transmission. Maintain current patrol sectors per original orders dated 28 February. That response gave Station Hypo 2 pieces of intelligence. First, it confirmed the submarine's general operational area. Second, it provided a real Japanese message with enough context, references to current patrol sectors and original orders, that cryptanalysts could use it to crack more code groups. Over the next 72 hours, Station Hypo analysts broke 127 new code group meanings from that single exchange, increasing their JN-25 readability from 15% to nearly 23%. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort called Lieutenant Commander Davis directly. "I don't know what your radio man did, but do it again. We just got more usable intelligence from one confused submarine exchange than we've gotten from 3 weeks of normal intercepts." Between March 1942 and August 1942, Richard Holt transmitted 173 fake Japanese messages. Not all of them worked. The Japanese ignored about 40%, but the ones that did work triggered chains of real Japanese communications, clarifications, corrections, confirmations, that provided Station Hypo with exactly the kind of material cryptanalysts needed to break codes. The technique was called poke the bear in classified communications. Make the enemy talk by confusing them, then exploit what they say when they try to resolve the confusion. But Holt was doing something more sophisticated than just poking random bears. He was studying which types of confusion worked best. Messages that appeared to contradict recent orders worked. Messages that contained ambiguous navigation references worked. Messages that seemed to promote junior officers or reassign personnel worked because they triggered administrative communications. Messages that looked too obviously fake didn't work. The Japanese would ignore them as enemy deception. The key was making the fake messages look authentic enough that Japanese operators had to take them seriously, but flawed enough that they generated questions. By April 1942, Holt had developed a taxonomy of effective deception messages. He documented everything in handwritten notebooks, message types, Japanese responses, which kinds of confusion generated the most follow-up traffic. His notes read like a psychological warfare manual written by someone who'd never heard of psychological warfare but had figured it out through trial and error. On April 22, 1942, Holt transmitted what would become his most consequential fake message. Station Hypo had been tracking a Japanese carrier task force assembling somewhere in the Central Pacific. Fragmentary decodes suggested a major operation was planned, but cryptanalysts couldn't determine the target. The intercepts kept referring to AF, a location designator that could have been anywhere from Midway to the Aleutians to Hawaii itself. Rochefort had developed a theory that AF meant Midway, but he needed proof. He needed the Japanese to transmit messages that would confirm it. The standard intelligence technique was to create a deception that would provoke telling responses, make the Japanese talk about Midway in ways that revealed it as the target. Rochefort's team devised a plan. Have Midway Island transmit an uncoded message claiming their water distillation equipment had failed. If AF really was Midway, Japanese intelligence would intercept that message and report it to their operational commanders. If Hypo then intercepted a Japanese message saying AF reports water supply problems, that would confirm AF ours Midway. The plan worked brilliantly. Within 24 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was experiencing freshwater shortages. That intelligence allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position American carriers near Midway in advance of the Japanese attack, leading to the decisive American victory at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. But what the classified histories don't mention, what remained buried in Hypo files until declassification decades later, is that Holt's fake messages played a role in that operation too. After Midway transmitted its fake water problem message, Holt broadcast a fake Japanese transmission that appeared to acknowledge the intelligence report. His message, if decoded, would have read, "Confirm target installation water supply inadequate. Adjust landing force equipment accordingly." The message was deliberately ambiguous enough that Japanese intelligence officers, when they intercepted it, had to figure out which unit had sent it and why. That triggered internal Japanese communications, confused messages between intelligence staff and operational commanders trying to determine if the water intelligence was accurate and which unit had reported it. Those confused Japanese messages, intercepted by Station Hypo, provided additional confirmation that the Japanese were indeed planning an operation against a target with water problems, Midway. The fake message didn't create the intelligence, but it amplified it, forcing the Japanese to generate more communications that cryptanalysts could exploit. After Midway, the effectiveness of Holt's technique became impossible for Navy intelligence to ignore. Station Hypo submitted a classified after-action report to Pacific Fleet Intelligence in July 1942 that included a previously overlooked factor in their cryptanalytic success. Operational stimulation of enemy communications through tactical deception has provided 18 to 22% increase in exploitable signal intelligence material between March and June 1942. In bureaucratic language, that meant Holt's fake messages were working. The report recommended expanding the program under controlled conditions with direct coordination between field radio operators and Station Hypo cryptanalysts. In August 1942, Richard Holt was transferred from USS Blue to Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. His official assignment, Communications Analysis Specialist, a title that didn't exist in Navy regulations and had to be specially created. His actual job, run a sanctioned program of radio deception targeting Japanese naval communications. The operation was designated Project Confusion in classified documents, though personnel involved called it Holt's noise machine. The objective wasn't sophisticated, just keep the Japanese confused about which messages were real, which were corrupted transmissions, and which were complete fabrications. That confusion would force them to generate clarifying communications that Station Hypo could intercept and exploit. Between August 1942 and February 1943, Holt supervised a team of 12 radiomen operating from a secure facility at Pearl Harbor. They transmitted an average of 43 fake or corrupted Japanese messages per week, targeting different elements of the Japanese fleet structure: submarine forces, destroyer divisions, transport convoys. Each fake transmission was carefully crafted to trigger specific types of responses. The psychological impact on Japanese communications was measurable. Japanese radio operators began requesting message confirmations at rates 3 times higher than before March 1942. Japanese communications security protocols became so paranoid that legitimate messages were sometimes ignored because they seemed suspicious. The Imperial Japanese Navy, masters of signals discipline and operational security, had become so worried about fake messages that they started doubting their own systems. But the program almost collapsed in November 1942 when Japanese naval intelligence came dangerously close to figuring out what was happening. A Japanese communications security analysis, later captured and translated after the war, documented anomalous transmission patterns inconsistent with known fleet operating procedures. The report recommended a complete overhaul of code systems and radio protocols. If the Japanese had implemented those changes, Allied cryptanalysis would have been set back months or years. Station Hypo would lose its ability to read JN-25. The entire intelligence advantage that had won Midway would evaporate. Holt's response was brilliant in its counterintuitive logic. Instead of stopping the fake transmissions to avoid detection, he increased them dramatically and made them more obviously fake. Over 2 weeks in November, his team broadcast 67 messages that were deliberately, unmistakably fraudulent. Wrong call signs, impossible number patterns, mathematical errors that any trained operator would immediately recognize. The Japanese intercepted these obvious fakes and concluded that American attempts at deception were crude and easily detected. The security analysis report was updated. Enemy deception efforts confirmed but assessed as technically unsophisticated. Current security protocols adequate. Major code system changes not required at this time. The Japanese had decided the fake messages were amateur attempts that posed no real threat. That assessment let them ignore the more sophisticated fakes that Holt had been transmitting earlier, the ones that actually worked. By flooding the system with obvious garbage, Holt had camouflaged the effective deception within the noise. It was psychological warfare at a level of sophistication that wouldn't be formally studied until decades later. Holt had no training in psychology or deception operations. He'd figured it out through intuition, trial and error, and careful observation of how Japanese operators responded. In December 1942, Station Hypo's JN-25 readability reached 40%, the highest it had been since the code system was introduced. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, in his final report before being relieved of command due to bureaucratic politics, credited multiple factors including innovative operational deception programs that successfully exploited enemy communications behavior patterns. Project Confusion continued through mid-1943, when the Japanese implemented JN-25 version D, a completely new codebook that required Allied cryptanalysts to start over. The deception program was suspended because there wasn't enough understanding of the new code to craft effective fake messages. By that point, the program had generated an estimated 2,800 exploitable Japanese communications that wouldn't have existed without tactical provocation. Station Hypo analysts calculated that those additional messages had accelerated code-breaking timelines by an average of 6 weeks across multiple operations. 6 weeks of intelligence advantage doesn't sound dramatic. But in 1942-1943, when Japanese and American forces were fighting for control of Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific, 6 weeks could mean the difference between intercepting an enemy convoy or losing a transport loaded with Marines. It could mean knowing where Japanese carriers were positioned or sailing blindly into an ambush. The monetary value was incalculable, but Navy analysts attempted estimates anyway. If Project Confusion prevented even 3 ship losses through better intelligence, the program had saved more than the cost of 15 B-29 bombers. If it shortened the Solomon Islands campaign by 2 weeks through better operational awareness, it saved thousands of casualties. But none of that appeared in public records. Project Confusion remained classified until 1996, when bulk declassification of WW2 intelligence documents finally revealed its existence. Even then, most historians missed it. Buried in thousands of pages of technical cryptanalysis reports, it looked like a minor footnote to the main story of code-breaking. Richard Holt left active duty in November 1945 and returned to Omaha, Nebraska. He worked for Union Pacific Railroad as a communications supervisor, the same job his father had held for 37 years. He married in 1947, had 4 children, and lived quietly. He never told his family what he'd done during the war beyond radio work in the Pacific. The Navy had classified his entire service record. Even if he'd wanted to talk about Project Confusion, he legally couldn't. The classification wouldn't be lifted until long after his death. Holt died in 1991 at age 73 from heart failure. His obituary in the Omaha World Herald mentioned his Navy service, his railroad career, and his volunteer work with veterans organizations. It described him as a man who served quietly and asked for nothing in return. In 2003, a National Security Agency historian named Dr. Robert Hanyok was researching Y2 Signals intelligence operations when he discovered Project Confusion files in declassified archives. He tracked down Holt's service records, interviewed surviving Station Hypo personnel, and reconstructed what had happened. Hanyok published his findings in a 2004 NSA historical monograph titled Tactical Radio Deception in the Pacific, Project Confusion and the Evolution of SIGINT-Enabled Information Operations. The paper was initially classified, then declassified with redactions in 2007. The conclusion stated, Richard Holt's innovations in tactical radio deception represent an early example of what would later be formalized as information warfare, using enemy information systems against themselves not by breaking them, but by making them unreliable. His work demonstrated that signals intelligence doesn't only come from intercepting enemy communications, but from manipulating enemy behavior to generate communications worth intercepting. In 2008, the NSA posthumously awarded Holt its Exceptional Civilian Service Award, recognizing his contributions to signals intelligence. The award was presented to his daughter, who hadn't known her father had done anything classified until the NSA contacted her. She later told interviewers, "Dad never talked about the war. He'd answer questions if we asked, but mostly he'd just say he did radio work. I had no idea he'd done something important. He was just my dad who fixed our radios when they broke and helped me with math homework." The techniques Holt pioneered didn't die with him. Modern electronic warfare and cyber operations use similar principles, confusing enemy systems not by destroying them, but by making them generate information that helps you while confusing them, inserting false data into enemy networks, broadcasting misleading signals, creating uncertainty that forces adversaries to break operational security to resolve confusion. It's sophisticated now, conducted by specialists with advanced degrees and cutting-edge technology. But the core concept, make your enemy talk by confusing them, then exploit what they say, came from a 24-year-old radio man from Nebraska who figured it out with nothing but curiosity, notebooks, and the willingness to try something nobody had authorized. 6 months, 173 fake transmissions, 2,800 exploitable Japanese messages. One crazy idea that worked because sometimes the best way to break a code isn't decryption, It's making the enemy so confused about their own codes that they hand you the intelligence you need. Richard Holt never broke JN-25. He didn't need to. He just made the Japanese break it for him, one confused transmission at a time.